The fallen woman of the Victorian era was named the great social evil of the time. These women were normally working class and chose this path due to the economic doors it could open for them, but they were seen to cast a shadow on the well-run middle-class home. The shame and disgust that surrounded these women was something that, especially in a sexually reformed Victorian England, was seen as a permanent mark. But I want to discuss the potential for redemption that faced these women and the factors contributing to that. I'll be looking at the poems Goblin Market and Cousin Kate, both by Christina Rossetti, to help me examine the factors around this under different lenses. What made these women outcasts? Why was redemption an idea not easily considered? And how did redemption happen? It is extremely important to consider the link Rossetti had to prostitutes when looking at her work. She was one of the many middle-class women who volunteered in and donated to the Magdalene houses. The social purity movement created the Magdalene's Friend initiative, which were homes where fallen women and prostitutes were given religious and moral instruction and practical training for the service industry. She worked in these houses from 1859 to 1870. This proximity gave her a uniquely sympathetic view towards these women. The public opinion was generally unforgiving, as fallen women were associated with the troublesome poor and venereal diseases, and deemed directly responsible for the debilitating health of the male population. Developing tertiary syphilis often meant a fate of a painful, lingering death, usually in the mid-40s. Bracebridge Hemming, who worked as a barrister in the 1860s, researched prostitutes in England and claimed that these women were nothing better than a paid murderess committing crime with impunity. There are references to being an unclean thing in Cousin Kate, which we can infer has connotations of not only moral cleanliness, but physical as well. Goblin Market portrays Laura's fate as becoming old and barren. Her tree of life drooped from the root. This is seen as a representation of the effects that syphilis had on the body. This exponential increase in disease led to the Contagious Diseases Act of 1864, which stated that if a woman was even suspected of being a prostitute, she could be detained and forcibly examined, and if she was found to have a venereal disease, she would be locked up until cured. But it's important to note that a cure for syphilis wasn't found until 1943. This act thrust prostitution directly into the public eye, where before it was ignored. And this meant the problem became a perfect opportunity for middle-class philanthropy that Rossetti was already involved in to thrive. She wrote Goblin Market in 1859, when she was working at one of these houses, and it was originally branded as a children's story. The idea of strength is intrinsically linked to the idea of being a proper woman in Victorian society. Men were seen as superior to women in many ways except morality, where women were able to control their sexual desires in a way that was beyond male capability. So, when a man failed morally, it was seen as an inevitable, yet temporary lapse in judgment, whereas when a woman failed, it was seen as a great personal failure. The idea of this moral temptation was shown through the metaphor of having an uncontrollable appetite. We see this here in Goblin Market, where Laura's curiosity to try the fruit is the cause of her problems. Fruit itself has religious connotations, which links back to temptation, the taking away of innocence and the gaining of shame in the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve give in to temptation and eat the fruit as their eyes will be opened by consumption. The idea of strength also runs much deeper into Goblin Market, as Lizzie's strength is what saves Laura. As for Rossetti, sin does not necessarily cancel sisterhood. Her refusal to eat the fruit, even after she is jostled and clawed by the goblin men, is an example of the strength that society thinks women should have. This could represent the differences between the working class and middle class women, as they were seen to either be sexless ministering angels or sensuously oversexed temptresses of the devil. The violence we see here, where the goblin men tore her gown and tried to make her eat, could be a commentary on how forceful men were, as even if a woman was raped or assaulted, she would be deemed fallen. The idea of sisterhood could be what links the working and middle class women together here. We see that Lizzie, for the first time in her life, began to listen and look for the goblin men to help Laura. This shows that the middle class women were willing to expand their rather limited worldview to help the fallen. These women were meant to know nothing except what is good, and their willingness to delve into another world could come from the feeling of sisterhood amongst women, and the empathy that was involved, bonding them together. We can also see this comparison made in Cousin Kate. Rossetti juxtaposes the fallen woman with the wife, where Kate is the angel and the speaker is the temptress. However, the idea of strength is portrayed differently here. The speaker talks about the strength not to betray her family and women as a whole. She holds resentment, saying she would have spit in his face if it had been the other way round, and feels betrayed. She has the strength not to be fooled by his trap, even though she's already been subjected to it. The Lord at one point had also filled her heart with care, telling us why the resentment runs so deep for the both of them. Rossetti saw motherhood as something containing heroic strength. We see that mothers are amongst the strongest figures in her poetry, which we have an example of here. The speaker's strength comes from the resilience to still have a voice now she's been exiled from society. Through the form of being the speaker of the poem, she has the strength to narrate her own story. Here we can make a comparison to Jenny by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christina's brother. Here he talks of his sympathy for the prostitute Jenny, as he knows she's condemned by others in Victorian society. Poor shameful Jenny, full of grace, thus with your head upon my knee, whose purse may be the lodestar of your reverie. But here we see Jenny as passive. She's physically asleep for the entirety of the poem. She doesn't get her own voice due to the perceived shame and sympathy from the speaker. Similar to Cousin Kate, in Goblin Market, the voice is empowering to women, showing no male characters whatsoever, and using the goblins as an extended metaphor for men. Class plays a role in the possibility for redemption of fallen women, as prostitution reflects far more about Victorian class structure than female immorality. First, middle-class men. The only people who could afford to consistently use prostitutes were middle-class men. They would use them before and sometimes after they were married. It is important to consider as well that a middle-class man was not allowed to marry until he proved he earned enough money, often leaving men unwed until their early 30s. Being a working-class woman was seen as a breeding ground for prostitution. In both poems, the characters are seen to be working class. The speaker in Cousin Kate identifies herself as a cottage maiden in the first line of the poem, bringing the class difference to the forefront of the story. And in Goblin Market, the two sisters are assumed to be working class, as they talk of how they fed their poultry and fetched in honey, amongst other things, all tasks a middle-class woman wouldn't do herself. A lot of these women desperately needed to make money to raise their children. Petty theft was more profitable than petty manufacturing, and in turn prostitution was more profitable than either. Middle-class women were vital, as their philanthropy was seen as the actual redemption that these women needed, Rossetti being the perfect example of this. These women were thought to be particularly suited to promoting Christian values in their community. Magdalene houses were one of the only ways that society would accept you as saved from a life of immorality and disease. This relates to Goblin Market, where we can see that Lizzie saves Laura through morality and genuine selfless love for her fellow women or sisters. Middle-class women were also affected by some of the prejudices that faced the fallen women. They could be forcibly examined, and if they were found to have venereal diseases, kept in lockhouses. The irony is that if a middle-class woman did have syphilis, she would most likely have gotten it from her husband and his use of prostitutes, but he would never be punished. Avoiding justice is a theme we can see in both poems, where the only people punished are women. Even with the focus on women being taken advantage of, there is an uncomfortable societal reflection where the double standard for men and women is incredibly apparent. In conclusion, there was a possibility for the redemption of the fallen woman, but entirely depended on their middle-class counterparts saving them. The idea for redemption boils down to the idea of a woman's purity being her only value. There are theories that state that Laura is cured by realising that what she pined for is not really desirable, which again only centres the idea of desirability as a great need for women. As discussed, there are many reasons why a woman may fall. In Cousin Kate, the speaker is doing what she thinks she must to please the upper classes, and in Goblin Market, it is mere innocent curiosity getting the better of Laura. We also discussed examples where women did this just to feed their families, because the middle-class men who condemned them in public made it the most profitable profession for them in private. E.W. Thomas, who is the secretary to the London Female Preventative and Reformatory Institution, stated that these women were much more sinned against than sinning. Reformation comes from the problematisation of prostitution, one of the world's oldest professions, where the middle class needed to be superior in their evangelical morality. Thank you for listening.